I stared at the note on the table, my hands trembling as I read the words again. I'll be waiting for you tonight. Just 8 words, but they were enough to unravel everything I thought I knew about my life. It wasn't just a note, it was a promise, a confession, and a challenge. Caleb, my stepfather, had written it. He was 57, composed, confident, the kind of man whose presence filled the room without effort. Yet in this moment, it wasn't his authority that consumed me, it was the tension crackling in the air since the day we first crossed a line neither of us dared to admit. The house was silent, the kind of silence that amplifies every thought until they're deafening. My chest felt tight, my breathing uneven. What did he mean? What did he want from me? No, the better question was, what did I want from him? Because deep down, I knew the answer. And that was the part that terrified me the most. I'd always admired Caleb. He was thoughtful, kind, and carried himself with a quiet power. But admiration had turned into something else. Over time, our casual conversations grew deeper. His compliments lingered a little too long. The way his eyes followed me felt more than paternal. And if I was being honest, I didn't shy away from his attention. I didn't want to. But tonight, this was different. That note changed everything. It demanded something from me I wasn't sure I could give. Or maybe I was afraid of how eagerly I wanted to. My heart raced as I sat on my bed, clutching the piece of paper like it held all the answers. But there were no answers, only questions. Questions that had kept me awake night after night, wondering how far we could go before it became something we could never undo. I glanced at the clock. Midnight. My hands felt clammy as I pushed myself off the bed. Every step I took toward the door felt heavier than the last. I wasn't even sure where I was going, just that I couldn't stay still anymore. My thoughts ran wild. Did he mean tonight? What would he say? What would I say? The air was electric with anticipation, the kind that builds before a storm. As I stepped into the hallway, the house seemed larger, emptier than it ever had before. The faint creak of the floorboards under my feet sounded like a drumbeat in the silence. I reached the top of the stairs and froze. The living room light was off, but the faint glow of the moon illuminated the space just enough for me to see. There was no movement, just the stillness of the night and the rapid pounding of my heart. And then I saw it, another note. It was folded neatly and placed on the corner of the coffee table, waiting like a dare. My pulse quickened as I approached, the words scrawled in his familiar handwriting sending a chill down my spine. If you're ready, come outside. Outside. My fingers clenched the note so tightly it crumpled in my hands. Ready for what? Was I? The line between excitement and fear blurred so completely, I couldn't tell which one dominated. But one thing was clear, I couldn't turn back now. Whatever Caleb had planned, whatever he wanted to say, it would change everything. I reached the back door, my hand hovering over the handle. The night outside looked darker than usual, the stars hidden behind a veil of clouds. The air smelled faintly of rain, a promise of a storm that might never come. Just like the storm I felt brewing inside me. My body was rooted in place, every nerve screaming for me to open the door, to step into the unknown. What would happen next? I didn't know. But I knew one thing for certain, this was only the beginning. If you think you've guessed what's coming, you're wrong. The truth is stranger, darker, and far more twisted than you can imagine. Stay with me, because what happens next will blow your mind. It started with the smallest of things. That summer, when we all went to the lake, I noticed Caleb watching me. Not the casual, fatherly glance I was used to, but something more. His eyes lingered, tracing my movements as I stood at the water's edge. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but the warmth that bloomed in my chest told a different story. It was during those quiet, unassuming moments that things began to shift. At first, it was subtle, a comment about how much I'd grown, a question about my future. "What do you want to do with your life?" he'd asked one evening, as we sat at the picnic table watching the sun dip below the horizon. His voice was calm, steady, but there was something about the way he listened, really listened, that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't before. When we returned home, those conversations continued. My mom, always busy with work or household tasks, left Caleb and me alone more often than not. At first, it felt natural. We'd talk in the kitchen while he cooked dinner or cleaned up after a meal. The topics were innocent enough: books, movies, my plans for the upcoming school year. But over time, those conversations deepened. One evening, as I helped him chop vegetables, he sighed heavily. "Your mom's an amazing woman," he said, his voice soft, almost distant. "But sometimes I feel like I'm invisible to her." I froze mid-slice, unsure how to respond. "What do you mean?" He shook his head, his eyes fixed on the cutting board. "It's hard to explain. She's so focused on everything else, the house, her job. Sometimes it feels like I'm just here." There was a vulnerability in his words that caught me off guard. Caleb, who always seemed so sure of himself, so composed, suddenly felt human in a way I hadn't seen before. "I'm sure she cares," I offered, my voice tentative. He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe." After that, I started to notice more. The way he lingered in the kitchen after dinner, waiting for me to join him. The way his hand would brush against mine when he passed me a plate. The way his compliments became more specific, more personal. "You have a good head on your shoulders," he said one night. "You're going to do amazing things." His words filled me with a strange mix of pride and discomfort. I couldn't ignore the growing tension between us, but I also couldn't bring myself to pull away. If I was being honest, I didn't want to. One night, after my mom had gone to bed, Caleb and I stayed up watching a movie. It was some old black and white classic he loved, but I barely paid attention to the screen. I was hyper-aware of him sitting next to me, close enough that our knees almost touched. The room was dark, lit only by the flickering glow of the TV. At one point, he reached over to adjust the volume, his arm brushing against mine. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt through me. I glanced at him, and for a moment, our eyes met. He didn't look away, and neither did I. The air between us felt charged, like the moment before a storm. "Do you like it?" he asked, nodding toward the screen. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to focus. "It's good," I lied. My voice sounded strange, even to me, too soft, too uncertain. He smiled, leaning back against the couch. "I thought you'd appreciate the storytelling. You're smart like that." The compliment shouldn't have meant so much, but it did. I felt my cheeks flush, and I was grateful for the darkness hiding my reaction. The next day, Caleb suggested we take a drive out of the city. "It's been a while since you practiced driving," he said casually over breakfast. My mom barely looked up from her laptop. "Sounds like a great idea," she said, her voice distracted. I wasn't sure if it was a great idea, but I agreed anyway. The drive out to the lake was quiet, the silence between us punctuated only by the occasional hum of the car. I tried to focus on the scenery, the rolling hills and dense woods that lined the road, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the night before. The way he'd looked at me. The way I hadn't wanted him to stop. When we arrived at the lake, Caleb parked the car in an empty lot overlooking the water. "All right," he said, climbing out and motioning for me to take the driver's seat. "Let's see what you remember." I slid behind the wheel, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Caleb settled into the passenger seat, his body close enough that I could feel his warmth. "Clutch down, shift into first gear," he instructed, his voice calm but firm. I did as he said, the car jerking slightly as it moved forward. "Good," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're getting the hang of it." We drove around the lot a few times, the car's movements becoming smoother with each pass. I was starting to relax, the rhythm of driving lulling me into focus, until Caleb leaned over to adjust the gear shift. His hand brushed against mine, firm and warm, and suddenly, every nerve in my body was on high alert. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded quickly, my grip tightening on the wheel. "Yeah, I'm fine." But I wasn't fine. The weight of his gaze, the closeness of his body, it was overwhelming. When I finally stopped the car at the edge of the lot, he didn't move back right away. Instead, he stayed close, his eyes studying me. "You did great," he said softly, his voice carrying a warmth that made my chest tighten. "Thanks," I murmured, my eyes fixed on the steering wheel. On the drive back, the tension between us was palpable. Neither of us spoke much, but I could feel him watching me, his presence filling the car like a physical weight. When we passed a small cafe on the side of the road, he suggested we stop for a bite. "It'll be nice to take a break," he said. We sat at a small table near the window, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow over the room. Caleb ordered coffee for himself and a slice of pie for me, insisting I try it. "Best pie you'll ever have," he said, his tone light. But as we ate, his gaze lingered on me, the weight of it making my pulse race. "You've grown up a lot," he said suddenly, his voice softer now. "You're not a little girl anymore." I didn't know how to respond. My hands fidgeted with the edge of the napkin as I looked down, avoiding his eyes. "Thanks," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The rest of the drive home was quiet, but the silence felt different. Charged. Unspoken words hung between us, heavy and undeniable. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the edge of something we couldn't come back from. And part of me didn't want to. Autumn arrived with its golden hues and crisp air, bringing a shift I couldn't quite explain but could feel with every passing day. Caleb had started staying home more often when Mom went to work. At first, it seemed coincidental, maybe he was just between projects or taking time to relax. But as the days stretched into weeks, his presence became a constant. And with it, so did the tension that buzzed quietly between us. One evening, after dinner, he asked if I wanted to watch a movie. Mom had retreated upstairs, exhausted from work, and the house felt unusually still. "It's an old classic," Caleb said, holding up the DVD case. "You might like it." I hesitated but agreed. Sitting on the couch beside him felt strangely intimate in the dimly lit living room. The glow of the screen flickered across his face, highlighting the lines that added depth to his features. Halfway through the film, his arm shifted, brushing against mine. It was such a small touch, so fleeting, but it sent a spark racing through me. I glanced at him, but he didn't seem to notice, or maybe he pretended not to. His focus remained on the screen, though I couldn't help but notice how close we were sitting. My pulse quickened, and for the rest of the movie, I was hyper-aware of every movement, every breath. The next day, Caleb helped me decorate the living room for an upcoming family dinner. Mom had left early for errands, leaving the two of us alone. We worked in comfortable silence, hanging strings of twinkling lights along the walls. As I stretched to reach a high corner, the ladder wobbled slightly beneath me. Caleb was there in an instant, steadying me with firm hands on my waist. "Careful," he said, his voice low, close to my ear. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding as I climbed down. "Thanks," I murmured, avoiding his gaze. But when I turned to pass him another strand of lights, our hands met, his fingers brushing mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. His touch lingered, his eyes locked on mine. The air between us thickened, charged with an unspoken tension that neither of us dared acknowledge out loud. Finally, he pulled back, clearing his throat. "You're doing a good job," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes betrayed something deeper. As the days passed, these moments grew more frequent. A shared glance that lasted a second too long. A touch that lingered just a bit longer than it should. It was as though we were caught in an invisible web, each thread pulling us closer together. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, reading too much into innocent gestures. But the truth was harder to ignore. One evening, Caleb surprised me by cooking dinner. Mom was working late again, and the kitchen smelled of roasted garlic and herbs as I walked in. "Wow," I said, impressed. "You've been busy." He looked up from the stove, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thought it'd be nice to have something ready for when your mom gets back." We ate together at the small kitchen table, the conversation easy and light. But as the meal went on, I caught him watching me. His gaze was steady, unflinching, and it made my cheeks burn. "What?" I asked, forcing a nervous laugh. "Nothing," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Just, you remind me of someone." I tilted my head, curious. "Too." He hesitated, his smile fading slightly. "No one you'd know. Just someone I used to care about." The weight in his voice sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to ask more, but the moment felt too heavy, too delicate to probe further. A week later, the tension finally boiled over. It was late, the house quiet except for the faint hum of the heater. I was in the living room, reading a book, when Caleb walked in. He hesitated at the doorway, as if deciding whether to say something. Finally, he spoke. "Can we talk?" I looked up, my heart skipping a beat. "Sure." He sat down beside me, closer than usual. For a moment, he didn't say anything, his hands fidgeting slightly in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost hesitant. I've been meaning to say this for a while, but things feel different lately. I felt my breath catch in my throat. Different how? He met my eyes, and the intensity of his gaze made my pulse race. I don't know, he admitted. It's like there's something between us. His words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. I didn't know what to say, but the silence that followed said more than words ever could. It's not just me, is it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, unable to lie. No, I said softly. It's not just you. For a moment, we just sat there, the space between us shrinking with every passing second. Then, slowly, he reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. It was such a small gesture, but it felt monumental, like a line being crossed. I don't know where this is going, he said, his voice trembling slightly. But I can't ignore it anymore. Neither could I. The pull between us was too strong, too undeniable. And in that moment, I knew we were standing on the edge of something that would change everything. The note sat on the table, simple and unassuming, but it felt like it weighed a ton. Meet me tonight. The words echoed in my mind all day, pulling at my thoughts, refusing to let go. Caleb's handwriting was neat, deliberate, the kind of script that demanded attention. This wasn't a mistake. He knew exactly what he was doing. I paced my room as the hours ticked by, every nerve in my body on edge. My mind kept replaying the moments that had led us here, his lingering touches, the way his voice softened when we were alone, the look in his eyes that seemed to say everything his words didn't. I told myself I shouldn't go, that this was a line we couldn't cross, but the pull to see him was stronger than the warnings screaming in my head. As the clock struck 11, I made up my mind. Grabbing my sweater, I slipped out of my room, the house silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. The cool night air greeted me as I stepped onto the back porch, the faint scent of damp earth and pine wrapping around me. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. And there he was. Caleb stood near the old oak tree at the edge of the property, his figure partially hidden in the shadows. His hands were in his pockets, his posture tense but deliberate. He turned as I approached, his expression a mixture of relief and something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. You came, he said, his voice low and steady, but there was a hint of uncertainty in it. I nodded, my throat dry. I wasn't sure if I should. His lips curved into a faint smile, but his eyes remained serious. Neither was I when I left the note. The silence between us was heavy, filled with unspoken words and a tension that felt almost tangible. Finally, he spoke. I've been trying to figure this out. Trying to make sense of it. Had you? I asked, my voice softer than I intended. Because I haven't. His gaze flicked to the ground, his brow furrowing. I don't know if there's a way to make sense of it, he admitted. But I couldn't keep pretending. I took a step closer, the crunch of leaves under my shoes the only sound in the stillness. What do you want, Caleb? He looked up then, his eyes locking onto mine. Honesty, he said simply. I want us to stop lying to ourselves. My chest tightened, a mixture of fear and something dangerously close to hope swelling inside me. And then what? I asked, barely above a whisper. I don't know, he said, his voice almost breaking. But I can't keep ignoring this. Ignoring you. His words hung in the air, cutting through the cool night like a blade. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like he could see every thought I'd tried to hide. But instead of pulling away, I found myself stepping closer, the space between us shrinking. Do you think this is a mistake? I asked, my voice trembling. He hesitated, his jaw tightening. Maybe, he said finally. But it doesn't feel like one. I didn't know what to say. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, but my body seemed to know exactly what it wanted. My fingers twitched at my sides, aching to reach out, to close the distance between us. As if reading my thoughts, Caleb took a tentative step forward. I'm not asking for anything, he said softly. I needed you to know. I searched his face, looking for some sign of hesitation, some hint that he might be as scared as I was. But all I saw was sincerity, the kind that made my heart ache. And now I know, I said, my voice barely audible. The moments that followed felt like they stretched on forever. Neither of us moved, neither of us spoke, but the air between us seemed to hum with unspoken words. Finally, Caleb broke the silence. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice raw. "If this is too much, if you don't feel the same, just tell me." I opened my mouth to speak, to say the words that would put an end to this, but they wouldn't come. Because the truth was, I didn't want him to stop. As wrong as it felt, as much as I knew this could destroy everything, I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him. "I can't," I whispered. His eyes widened slightly, the faintest flicker of surprise crossing his face. "You can't?" I shook my head, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. "I don't want to." The relief in his expression was instant, but it was tempered by something else, something deeper. "Then what happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I can't walk away." He stepped closer, his hand reaching out hesitantly, as if afraid I might change my mind. When his fingers brushed mine, I felt a spark shoot through me, and I didn't pull away. Instead, I let his hand close around mine, his touch grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. "I've wanted this for so long," he confessed, his voice trembling slightly. "But I didn't think you felt the same." "I didn't know I did," I said honestly. "Not until now." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, he lifted my hand to his lips, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to my knuckles. The gesture was tender, almost reverent, and it sent a shiver down my spine. "This changes everything," he said, his voice low. "I know," I replied. "But maybe that's okay." We stood there for what felt like hours, the world around us fading into the background. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or what this meant for us, but in that moment, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the way his hand felt in mine, the warmth of his gaze, and the quiet promise lingering between us. The night air was thick with something neither of us dared to name. My fingers were still caught in his thumb running slow, deliberate circles over my skin. The silence between us was heavier than ever, charged with something neither of us could pull away from. "Let's go," Caleb whispered suddenly, his voice low but firm. "Go where?" My voice barely made it past my lips. "Somewhere we won't be seen." I hesitated, but only for a moment. He didn't wait for my answer, he just took my hand and led me away from the yard, his grip firm but gentle, like he was afraid I'd change my mind. We walked for what felt like forever, the dark swallowing us whole as we made our way deeper into the woods. I should have been scared, but I wasn't. The only thing I could feel was the heat of Caleb's palm against mine and the way my pulse quickened every time he looked at me. After what felt like an eternity, we reached it, a small, abandoned hunting cabin tucked away from everything. I'd seen it before, but never like this. Tonight, it felt different. Secluded. Safe. Like it had been waiting for us all along. Caleb pushed open the door, revealing the dusty wooden interior. The moonlight streamed through the cracks in the old walls, casting silver streaks across the floor. "We won't be disturbed here," he murmured, glancing back at me. I stepped inside, my breath catching as I took in the space. It was small, almost empty, except for an old couch pushed against the far wall and a pile of blankets left in the corner. My heart pounded against my ribs. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Caleb turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "No," he admitted. "But I know I can't stop this anymore." The distance between us disappeared in an instant. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer. The first touch was slow, almost hesitant, like he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. I pressed closer, my hands tangling in his shirt as his fingers traced a slow path down my spine. The warmth of his body against mine sent a shiver through me, the last remnants of hesitation crumbling away. For a moment, we just stayed there, his forehead resting against mine, our breaths mingling in the dark. "If we do this," he murmured, "there's no going back." I swallowed hard, my fingers curling into his shirt. "I don't want to go back." And that was all it took. I wanted this. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. After, the air in the cabin was thick with something unspoken. Caleb lay beside me, his arm draped loosely over my waist, his fingers tracing absent patterns against my skin. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. But reality was creeping in, pressing against the edges of the moment we had just shared. I could feel it in the way his breathing slowed, in the tension settling in his shoulders. "What happens now?" I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He exhaled, his grip tightening just slightly. I don't know. Neither did I. But as I lay there, tangled in him, I knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again.